Good afternoon. I'm Anthony Painter. I'm Director of Policy and Strategy here at the RSA, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's event. Just before we begin, could I ask you to turn your mobile phones to silent? We're live streaming today's discussion, so welcome to those of you joining us online. And a reminder, the hashtag is RSA Crime, if you'd like to get involved on Twitter. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Tom Gash. Tom is a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics Mannheim Centre for Criminology, and he's an independent advisor to governments in the UK and internationally. Tom was part of the Institute for Government's initial setup team in 2008 and director of research there until last year, although he's still there for a day or so a week. Prior to that, he was a senior crime policy advisor in the Prime Minister's strategy unit and a strategy consultant at the Boston Consulting Group. Tom's a regular commentator in the print and broadcast media, and most importantly, the author of a new book, Criminal: The Truth About Why People Do Bad Things. He joins us to discuss that today. It's a fantastic book. It's absolutely packed full of great stuff on crime and justice, but probably more than that. It opens up discussions about biology, education, society, social and public policy reform more widely. So we'll hear what his thoughts on the basis of that research there in a moment. Yesterday, the RSA launched a new paper outlining the scope of a new project, the Future Prison. We've got the aim of improving offender rehabilitation, so this is extremely timely. We also did some work last year with the Metropolitan Police, looking at how they might change to respond to some of the evidence that Tom refers to. So without further ado, look forward to hearing Tom's thoughts. After he's given us his presentation, he and I will have a bit of a conversation and we'll open it out to you, and we'll finish about 2 o'clock. But I'd like to introduce Tom.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony, and thank you to the RSA for hosting this event today. It's a fantastic organisation, the RSA, as you know, and I follow its work on crime and justice closely, and I'm quite excited about the new project on prisons and the future of prisons. Thank you to everyone for coming, of course, because it's nice to be around people who also care about and are interested in crime and interested in changing the public debate about crime, which is one of my main purposes in the discussion today. Today, my main job is to try and convince you of one of the arguments in my book. That argument is that we can make small changes that can dramatically reduce crime. We like to think that big problems like crime have big solutions, but sometimes they can have small solutions. And indeed, some of the big solutions, the bold policies that are announced in terms of tackling crime, are in fact much less effective than we might like to believe. I want you to question some of your beliefs about crime as a result of the talk today. I want you to question the assumption that some of those bold policies around tougher sentences do have a dramatic impact on crime. I want you to question whether we need broad-scale social reform, poverty reduction to reduce crime, or whether we can actually make inroads without it. The reason I want to do this is because my experience here and internationally has actually persuaded me that your views matter a great deal. We like to think of our politicians as very out of touch and aloof and not caring what we think, but in fact they spend a lot of money, a lot of time and effort in understanding what the public think. They spend money on focus groups, surveys. The media, likewise, we like to think of them as a broadcast unit. But have you noticed that the people who choose right-wing papers tend to have right-wing views, those that choose left-wing papers tend to have left-wing views. We seek out views that reinforce our own. And therefore, those outlets also respond to the views of the public, the views of their readerships. And of course, our views of crime also influence our attitudes and behaviours. They influence how we relate to our neighbours, our communities, how we relate to people who have committed crime at some point in their lives, how we respond when we become a victim. You probably have strong views about crime, because in my experience, everyone does. I started my career in management consulting, and I'll tell you there's nothing like it to stop a dinner time conversation. You tell people you're a management consultant, everything goes silent. A couple of people say, what does that mean? If you say, I'm interested in crime and how to reduce it, immediately everyone wants to know the answer. But also, as you have that conversation and it unfolds, you realize that everyone actually has their own individual theory of crime, what causes crime, what we can do about it. The importance of examining our attitudes to crime is, I think, one of the neglected issues of our time. It's also something that I've been doing for about 10 years. And the course of my own re-examination of crime and its causes and what causes it has caused me to fundamentally change my beliefs about crime and has caused me to change the way I view the world. And so today I want to see if I can do a bit of the same for you. And I want to concentrate on this one truth, the idea that small changes can make a big difference. One of the stories that led me to this conclusion was one I discovered when I was in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit in the mid-2000s. And I came across a paper written by Ron Clark and Patricia Mayhew. And it was about motorcycle theft in Germany. Now, Ron and Patricia worked in the Home Office for several decades, in fact, and carefully studied patterns of crime. Now, the 80s and 90s, the crime of vehicle crime was something of huge interest, so they busily collected data very carefully, not just from the UK, but kept track on it in other countries as well. And in Germany, they noticed in the late 70s and early 80s, there was this phenomenally high rate of motorcycle theft. And in Germany that was an issue of political salience, there was concern about it. About 400 to 500 people each day in Germany were leaving their homes, their workplaces, or socializing with friends and finding that their motorbike had been nicked. That's 150,000 motorbikes stolen in Germany every year. In 1980, that was the case. But as Ron and Patricia started to look at the data over time, they started to realize that the motorcycle theft trend was going downwards. So by 1983, motorcycle theft had fallen by a quarter. This was good, they thought. It sounds promising. But by 1986, it had fallen to 2/3 of the level it was in 1980. So instead of 150,000 motorbikes being stolen each year, 50,000 were stolen each year. Imagine that sort of change applied to a crime type that you care about, and think about the profound impact that has on a society. So what caused this change? What was the new German crime-fighting strategy? Had they upped the sentences dramatically for motorcycle theft? Maybe there'd been some sort of employment scheme or program for people at risk use in the neighborhood? Well, it doesn't seem that that was the case at all. In fact, the Germans had discovered the need to pay more attention to road safety. In the 1970s, they decided that passengers should wear seatbelts in the front seat of their cars. And in 1978, they decided that all motorcycle riders should wear motorbike helmets. They decided this, and then they started to enforce it over a period of time in the early 1980s. And what it seems to have happened is that that's had a knock-on impact on motorcycle thefts. That seems strange. And yet, the more you understand about crime, the more you understand about the lack of planning and thought involved in it, the more you realize that actually what was happening was people were going about their business, and instead of thinking, oh, I'll nick that bike, they were thinking, might not nick that bike because I don't have a helmet, and the police will probably stop me because I don't have a helmet. And it was changing their in-the-moment decisions so dramatically that you ended up with a 2/3 reduction in motorcycle theft. This is an extreme change, and the theory actually that that was the case seems perhaps a little bit outlandish, but we can be very confident that it's the case because similar laws were introduced in the UK, in the Netherlands, in India, and there were similar effects. I believe that this case is not just a weird oddity, but one that does reveal important lessons about crime, important truths about the nature of crime. And one of those is obviously the lack of planning and thought involved in much criminal activity. We like to think of people who commit crime as being determined wage earners, people who are going out to get a wage in a day, commit a certain number of robberies, thefts, burglaries, and then once they've reached their target income for the day, they pack up their briefcase and go home. That's clearly not the case. The other thing I think it shows is that you don't necessarily need tough sentences to dramatically influence people's behavior. In fact, my book shows very clearly, and I think a very broad range of research now increasingly is showing that human beings are not very good calculators. And in the case of crime, we tend not to think about sentences until we've thought that there is a reasonable prospect of punishment. So the chance of being detected committing a crime is much more important than the punishment we receive after the event. And the third thing it shows is this myth about the importance of poverty and wage earning in crime and patterns of crime. Poverty matters in certain ways, and I explore that in a lot of detail. But the thing about this case is it wasn't a case that motorcycle thefts fell and other crime types rose. We know this because the Germans keep excellent data. They had data on motorcycle data, car data, bicycle theft data. Those trends in car crime and in bicycle theft, they were flat. Now, these are important general lessons in my view, but the case was clearly accidental. So the question that should interest us all is, can we apply some of these lessons deliberately? Can we use some of these learnings and these techniques and strategies to effectively reduce crime? And not only, in my view, can we, I think we've proved that we can do so in a number of different domains. In my book, I talk about the decline in car theft in the UK. Car theft in the UK is about a sixth of the level it was at its peak in the 1990s. I look also at metal theft, where a number of changes there, equally small, careful, planned, going with the grain and a true understanding of why people are actually committing crime, which circumstances are dragging people into criminal activity. I examine that as well. But today I want to talk about alcohol-related violence. Now, in the UK, we love a drink, and when we do have a drink, we tend to behave in slightly different ways, whether it's because the drink's an excuse to do so, or because it pushes us towards doing so is a big debate. But we're not, fortunately, the only ones who behave like this. So the Australians like a drink too. And Richard Wortley, who is professor at the UCL Centre for Crime Science, he's Australian, so he knows a thing or two about drinking. And he, I'm not casting aspersions, he's also conducted a wide range of work on how to reduce alcohol-related violence. He worked in particular with a number of colleagues and with government actors and agencies in a place called Surfers Paradise in Australia. I don't know if anyone knows Surfers Paradise. It sounds lovely. But actually, when you see the photos of it in the Australian media every year, you'll notice it doesn't seem quite so lovely. It tends to be photos of people drunk lying on the floor, showing their knickers, violence, lots of problems associated with this. And the problems in Surfers Paradise had got really quite acute. So in terms of health service costs, in terms of policing costs, and actually the image and reputation of the area, it's a small place when it's not descended on by hordes of visitors, about 20,000 population or something. But it swells when people come, and particularly there's a tradition in Australia called schoolies. So when people finish school, they tend to go to congregate en masse in one venue and have a large amount to drink. Violence rates were very high, and in Australia, you may have picked up this term, the one-punch deaths, partly because there was a tragic case recently in the UK in relation to this. But one of the things about violence is, while it can seem like a scuffle, the consequences of some of these things can be pretty acute and pretty dramatic. And one of the things that happens is that in a single conflict, a punch can be landed, but what kills them is not the punch, but the hit of the head on the pavement when someone falls. And so these are really serious cases that can emerge out of foolishness and nothing. And so in order to tackle this problem in Surfers Bay, again, they thought about a really bold strategy, but they thought, maybe we'll do that. Maybe instead we might just take a few small things and let's see what difference we can make if we do a few small things. So the first set of things they did was about reducing alcohol consumption. One of the reasons fights often occur in premises is things like spilt drinks, which happens when your coordination gets worse. People get into conflict over things like that. So they did things like reducing the glass sizes. They did things like reducing the binge drinking incentives. They did things like making non-alcoholic drinks cheaper, introducing food into venues. The second thing they did was started to think about clientele. So another fascinating thing about violence is, while in some cases there are unprovoked attacks, in many cases it takes two to have a fight. So if you fill a venue with people who are willing to have a fight, you will have a lot of fights. But if you have a half and half half people are willing to have fights, half aren't, you're much less likely to have those sorts of conflictual situations arising and erupting into violence with its catastrophic consequences. The third set of things were about managing the place and the space. So quite often, it's easy to spot where situations may arise, to manage clients, eject some, to spot things before they happen, to manage the space more effectively, to basically lower the temperature of a venue where violence can sometimes take place. And this they did through a range of strategies for training door staff. One of the things we've done in the UK over the last 20 years, very simple things like making sure that doormen don't have criminal records and avoiding some of these sort of classic pitfalls has been quite effective. And there it was quite effective too. So much so that these measures combined, which all seem relatively trivial, amounted to a 52% reduction in alcohol-related assaults in Surfers Paradise, making it much more of a paradise probably than it was before. Again, I think this reinforces some very important lessons about the nature of crime. An appreciation, I think, again, of how much our behaviour is actually influenced by our immediate circumstances. Now, I knew this anyway, because growing up, I'd have friends who sometimes would get into a fight one week and not get into a fight the next week. So I knew that behaviour was contingent on circumstances. But the more you look at patterns of crime, the more you realise just how much this is the case. In immediate circumstances, not broad social conditions. The second thing, again, is that detail matters here. It matters an enormous amount. So what might work as an alcohol reduction strategy in Surfers Paradise will probably not be identical to the one that would work in Cardiff, where they had another set of initiatives that achieved quite good results there. The third thing is, again, we don't necessarily need tough sentences. In fact, if you think about that example from Surfers Paradise, do we need the criminal justice system at all to reduce crime in that case? This was about businesses taking action to make their premises safer and more effective. It was about health services highlighting the problem initially, a huge range of different local actors, but not reinforced perhaps by the police. And the police, I do think, are vitally important for tackling crime, but not a whole criminal justice system solution. And again, this message about the capacity to do something without addressing all of the problems in the world, which I think is an incredible cause for optimism. So these two stories of crime reduction, I hope, are really encouraging. But when I raise them, I get a lot of counter-arguments. I get people saying, well, come on, this approach isn't going to solve everything, surely. I mean, the crime's just going to be pushed into another place. Well, as I've seen already, that doesn't necessarily happen. In fact, there are lots of different experiments that have looked at reducing crimes by changing immediate opportunities for crime and circumstances. One study looked at 100 such experiments and found that had effectively displaced or reduced crime. What they found is in 2/3 of these cases, there was no increase in crime elsewhere as a result of the reduction from the targeted initiatives that were put in place. In 1/3 of cases, there was a little bit more crime somewhere else, but nowhere near as much as was reduced by the experiment. And in about 1/3 of cases, there was a dispersion of benefits. So by reducing crime in one place, you had knock-on impacts on other crime types or on other geographies. And it's actually very easy to understand why that might be the case. If you think about crimes like gang-related violence, many of them have epidemic-type properties. So one initial conflict leads to another. If you can stop the initial conflict, you stop the tit-for-tat, you stop the reprisal, you stop the escalation of conflict. And so it's very important, in my view, not to think solely about displacement, but to recognize that we can have broader benefits from making small changes. The other reason I think that the idea that this won't solve everything is obviously not helpful is because, in my view, the reduction in crime over the last 20 years, and yes, crime has reduced quite dramatically, although is sort of wavering a little bit now, is in large part due to these types of measures. The number of cases we have now of things that have effectively reduced crime are very broad, but some of the most obvious ones are the reduction of cash and holding cash in licensed premises, in newsagents, in local shops, a very important factor. Things like anti-robbery screens in post officers back when when armed robbery was more of a thing than it is now. And there's a reason it's more of a thing. It's not because people aren't disposed to committing robbery anymore. It's a lot harder to do it. Then you think about things like street closures, which can be effective in terms of reducing prosecution, locking off back alleys. Again, that can be helpful in terms of reducing burglaries, street lighting, highlighting, reducing the temptingness of committing crimes in certain spaces and places. These, I think, have combined to have much more impact than we believe. And I think, importantly, a lot of the action is by businesses, governments regulating, not necessarily by the criminal justice system, which does have an impact, but should not be overstated. The other objection I get is that in some way my argument is immoral or amoral. Is that I don't care about morality. What is all this, this very sort of hard-headed view of things? What about actually punishing people because they deserve to be punished? And what about helping the poor because they're in a difficult situation? Well, let's take that second argument first about poverty. Well, first of all, I believe that more should be done to tackle poverty. But when it comes to crime, we have limited amounts of public money to spend. The poor are particularly affected and victimized by crime. We have a duty to them to spend that money as wisely as we possibly can and not to waste it. When it comes to justice and meting out punishments that fit the crime, or in some cases punishments that are extremely harsh, which many people do want, again, that's not my domain. I think that is a political decision. If you are willing to pay for vengeance to such a degree that you can no longer afford to do the things that will actually make your community and society safer, that is your political decision. That is your prerogative. Again, I would flip the morality of that point and say that the moral view is to say that we should do the things that work and protect our society in the long run. So why aren't we doing more of this stuff? Well, I think one of the things that the examples I've shared show is that we are starting to do much more of it. And actually, I think these approaches, these ways of thinking are gaining traction across the world. The problem is that so often it is hard politically to make these decisions because of your views, because of public views. There was an interesting event I did with Jackie Smith, the former Home Secretary, a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things she said was very interesting, which she said, I love all these ideas, but it's quite hard to say, I've gone into politics to make a lot of small changes. And then she also pointed out that, in fact, I wasn't even saying that she should do the small changes. I was saying that lots of other people should do the small changes at a much more localized level and in a way that was tailored to circumstances. So that obstacle is there. And the obstacle of trying to react to individual cases, in my view, is very strong. In my book, I talk about two worldviews of crime, two views that I think inform our natural knee-jerk responses. And one of them I call the heroes and villains view. This is sort of the view where there are people out there who are bad and do bad things, whereas my view is actually that there are people out there who can be nudged one way or the other towards doing good or bad things, depending on the time of the week of the day. And there obviously are differences between us as well. And there are people who are there who are the good guys to stop them, the heroes, and that normally is going to be the police and the criminal justice system. I talk about another worldview, which is the victims and survivors view, which is basically these poor people who commit crime. It's terrible for them. They've all had really hard lives, and that's actually, again, often the case. But underpinning this view is the sense that they economically need in some way to commit crime, which I don't think the evidence supports. So this heroes and villains and victim survivors view, I think both of those views come out whenever we have a major crime incident. It came out after the riots, and equally, when you get an individual case, you'll notice actually that quite often what comes out is this sort of knee-jerk view of this person is bad and we must make sentences very, very tough, and respond to the specific, really unusual case with the broad brush reform that affects many people who are very unlike the person who has been who's committed a crime in this particular case. The reason that they introduced the 3 strikes law in California was due to the murder of Polly Klaas by a repeat offender. and a very, very tragic case. But he was a particularly troubled individual who was very likely to go on to reoffend. The 3 strikes law that was introduced as a result of the crisis, the moral panic that emerged after that murder, the people who were affected by that 3 strikes did not look anything like the murderer in that case. They're very, very different people, very different backgrounds, much less serious crimes, much less chance of reoffending. So we need to be very careful about making policy in response to specific cases without thinking about how representative they are. So the book Criminal is about challenging some of these big myths and also a lot of smaller ones. In my book, I talk about the need to challenge the idea that we need more bobbies on the beat. I talk about questions of the impact of biology on behaviour, talk about immigration and crime, very hot topic at the moment. Suffice to say, I don't think immigration automatically increases crime rates. The point, though, is actually to allow people who read the book to go through their own journey of exploration. I obviously share the evidence that I've gathered from my research over the years, and I share the stories that I think are more representative of the norm than the ones we get pushed on us daily by the media. But I think everyone does have to take their own journey with this stuff to try and understand and examine more fully. I'm really pleased that all of you have come here today to challenge your own views about crime and to hear some different ideas, and I hope that we can all work together towards challenging crime fictions and replacing them with some crime facts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. As fascinating as we expected to find it. Now, I'm going to start off with the Jackie Smith conversation. So this is quite a tough place to start. Now, by the way, interestingly, Tough on Crime, Tough on the Causes of Crime really interestingly blends the heroes and villains, victims and survivors mentality quite ingeniously, actually.
Yeah.
But what it seems to me that we're locked in a sort of moral perspective here, but there's something else that's going on as well. And in your book, you talk about the mafia and our vision of crime as coming from the notion of the mafia as a global, hierarchical, violent organisation. And it seems to me that that conditions some of our responses to crime as well, which end up being hierarchical responses. So they're about new laws, they're about investment, they're about more police on the beat, very, very top down. How would you convince someone like Jackie Smith to break the stranglehold of that hierarchical view as a society in response to crime?
So I think it has to come from the fact that actually Jackie and others do care about the outcomes that people have in their communities. So their MPs and constituents' MPs, and people come to them all the time with specific issues and problems. And from that work, actually, from that more personal experience, they understand a bit more about the realities of crime and the dynamics of crime, and so ultimately do want to help their constituents. And so there has got to be that sort of realization that you cannot do the blanket approach all the time.
Yeah.
And that you need to devolve some of the responsibility. Now, what does that mean for what does a Home Secretary even do?
Yes.
My suspicion is that it's got to be, and it sounds dull, but it's got to be about actually tracking the outcomes. It's actually understanding what is happening to patterns of crime and having someone responsible in place to feel responsible for that. And I think one of the challenges is that I'm not sure that we necessarily have any organisation that is actually responsible for crime. I'm not proposing a big structural reform to create some new super body in government, by the way. That wouldn't be the answer. But I'm not sure that you can find the agency that genuinely believes that it's fully responsible for this stuff. The police have a sense that they are responsible for crime to a degree, but recognise if you speak to any senior copper, they will say, we don't hold all the levers. So those guys have all the drug treatment stuff that we want to get our hands on. None of our ex-offenders can get housing.
Right.
And so what I think the future is, and I'm encouraged by some of the developments going on in the UK at the moment, is a more local, coordinated approach to criminal justice and crime reduction. So I'm quite optimistic about what's happening in Greater Manchester, where they've just received local control over justice budgets, and policing budgets are already there. And so they can start to look at that area as a whole and say, can we join up services and do things a little bit differently here to tackle crime? And the responsibility can sit more there than it does in Westminster.
Which is kind of affords a sort of structural change response in many respects. But how is it that we can take the public conversation along with us towards this more sort of problem-solving approach? Do you think it needs a dialogue as well, doesn't it?
It does. So, I mean, an interesting domain where national government has a big role to play is around things like business regulation and, say, tackling things like online crime, and which people are talking about a lot. So I always say that the product designers at Apple probably have more influence on crime rates than your average senior policy official.
Yes.
And someone needs to have the conversation with that product designer and those organizations to understand how they're creating or reducing risks of theft. One of the things that's changed is with phone security's actually improved a bit, and it does seem to be playing out a little bit in terms of reductions in robbery in the UK. It's difficult to say because we didn't set that up as an experiment or anything, but an important change. So there's a conversation that needs to happen nationally about those things, but the conversation actually has got to be about, the political conversation is about the share of risks and costs across business, government, and citizens themselves. If you think about something like financial transactions, most of you now have probably got, instead of doing your online banking on, some of you may not do online banking, instead of doing your online banking just entering your password, now you probably have a little code thing as well. You've taken on a little bit more burden so that the banks and your money can be a little bit safer. Government has a set of people dealing with cybercrime. Businesses have armies of people dealing with cybercrime. And so the question is actually, well, who's going to pay for what? So some banks are thinking about no longer compensating and covering for people who are negligent. In the same way, if you leave your back door open, you can't get an insurance claim. What about if you do the equivalent of that on your computer? Yeah. So if you leave your password written on your computer screen, and then someone hacks into your bank account and makes some transactions, should the bank pay you back all that money that it's lost as a result of your negligence? Well, that's a political debate. That's the conversation that needs to happen, and that can be politically led and politically driven. And you can imagine that parties with different viewpoints on how much protection the public should get from the state would take different views on that equation.
And indeed, in that example, the police often want to make those very points, but it's politicians that block it. So there has to be license for a series of people to get into the debate. Now, in the book, I mean, there's lots of challenging aspects within the book. One of them is about poverty and crime. But one thing that seemed to come out for me is there is one aspect of poverty which does seem to be linked very closely with crime, and that's the access to status. And you've given 2 or 3 examples in the book. One is of prisoners leaving prison, and if they don't get access to not just a job, but a job with status, they're more likely to end up back in prison. And you also give the example of the homeboy industries in California, very, very successful at converting people away from gang-related activity, again by giving them a job with status. So there are some quite challenging social policy.
I think there are, but my point is really not that poverty doesn't matter, but it's not the fact that people don't have money that matters. It's actually people's identity and worth. And I think that does have a major impact, which is why I wouldn't be as crude as to say poverty has no impact on crime. It just has very complex impact. So actually, in one way, the fact that everyone got wealthier throughout the post-war era was probably one of the reasons that acquisitive crime went up. Everyone had TVs, stuff to nick. It does have that sort of impact. On the other hand, similarly, sometimes people are poor. They can't go out to drink. They don't have a big wage at the end of the month. They don't go out drinking on Friday night. One of the peak times for violence in the UK is after payday. So the ways in which money matters, the way in which poverty matters are odd. They're complicated. They're very, very unusual. And so it's much more about how they affect patterns of movement, patterns of socialization, because crime does accompany patterns of everyday life. And they also matter in how they affect identity. And I think the identity point is important because it starts to make you look not at the material aspects of people's upbringing, for example, but on the psychological, the psychosocial aspects of people's upbringing, which really do matter and make a big difference to people's life chances. When you look at the life histories of people who are really really entrenched in the justice system, they've had really tough lives, and that's had it's had a really profound impact on them. It's not true of everybody, but the people who are perennially cycling through the justice system you often find history of trauma of some sort. It's pretty acute.
If your kid can't resist marshmallows, watch out. That's kind of the one message that comes out of it. But I mean, there's plenty of evidence as to what works, but there seems to be less application of what works. And I just, the central thesis about the sort of small is beautiful design problem-solving approach, I think obviously is very productive up to a point. This has to touch institutions at some point. And, the work we did with the Metropolitan Police showed how difficult this is. There's loads of good stuff going on at a local level, adopting exactly the sort of rigorous approaches that you're looking at. What isn't necessarily happening, and it's not just the responsibility of the police, it's their relationship with a whole series of agencies and business and the voluntary sector and so on, is that it's not being scaled and spread because there's some blockages in the system somewhere. So the big aspects of this might also be important, because how those evidence-based solutions touch real-world institutions with all their blockages is probably one of the major challenges here.
Again, but the myths matter. So one of the things that I think undermines our ability to tackle crime is the image that we perpetuate about what police work is. What is the nature of police work? Over the last few days, there was a Police Federation conference, and the speeches all start with references to the dangerousness of police work. Now, police do really difficult jobs, but the defining characteristic of policing, are you going to say the defining characteristic of it is it's dangerous and physically dangerous? What does that say about the types of people you're wanting to pull into policing? What types of skills and attributes are you trying to draw in? What are you saying is valued in that service? Because I want my police to be fantastic communicators. I want to be people who can de-escalate conflict. I want a lot of really good data analysts. I want people who care about and understand that stuff. And there are people like this in the police service, and some of them feel undervalued, under-rewarded, and that's partly perpetuated by the image that all of us in society, from the Home Secretary down, give out about what we think proper policing is. So we have this idea of proper policing that I think actually makes us less safe. And I think this is why I think ideas interact. Ideas, these sort of constructs, these myths, which we say quite lazily, I think they matter.
They do.
And I think we need to sort of start to deconstruct them and think about healthier ways of representing
and
police.
It's actually, and what you're talking about is quite a radical shift in terms of organisation and culture. There is some real heavy lifting that needs to be done here across a whole series of players in our sort of common experience of crime and public safety. But it's far more radical than it sounds, initially. Yeah,
because you're talking about people who have their views and values and beliefs. And I set out writing this book with the goal of trying to influence some of those beliefs so that we could create space for better decision-making, for more evidence-based policy solutions. And I realised that was an incredibly ambitious thing to try and do, because actually what I do all the time is I'm always talking to people about crime, and I find that some people will move and shift their beliefs slowly a little bit, but many people will not have a debate on this level because the emotional blockers to it or the entrenched beliefs are incredibly strong. You have a different type of reaction to conversations about crime, and different sets of values come into play, and so it's very hard to have that conversation. It's a really emotive topic. So I think my ambition is ambitious, so maybe I can just change 1% of people a tiny bit about what they think, and that would be helpful, marginally.
Okay, let's open it out to the audience. I'm going to take questions in banks of 3. I'm going to try and get a mix of questioners, if at all possible. I haven't quite got it yet, but let's go for this gentleman here in a flowery shirt, and I'm going to go for this gentleman here with the tie, and then I'm going to go for this gentleman here just in the blue shirt. Please.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to see if I can get my opinion changed on this. What do you think of the campaigns excuse me, that the police have done in the past? Lock it or lose it, because to me that kind of says, it's okay to nick stuff if it's not locked.
Okay, thank you.
I'm John Muldoon, I'm a fellow. I'd like to probe a little bit your question about, or your point about having extra security on bank accounts. 'Cause in some parts of the economy it's known as moral hazard, and is that insurable? A little further down the line, there'll be people who say, well, insurance fraud's not really a crime because it's victimless. Though, of course, we're all the victims because we pay higher premiums. Do you think there's an interface between moral hazard and victimless crime?
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Danny Kushlik from Transform Drug Policy Foundation. We're a campaign group to end the war on drugs. Your ideas sound fantastic, and I think it's a really, really important conversation to pursue. As I'm sat here, and I wasn't planning this before I came in, I'm sat here looking from my 20 years experience of campaigning to change drug legislation. The drug laws are set up in a way that effectively designs crime in rather than designs it out. It effectively creates one of the largest illegal commodity trades on earth. And I'm just wondering, I guess and it really is a serious question about how it is possible to continue a discourse around sensible, evidence-based policy making and legislating and crime reduction at the same time that there is such an overwhelming commitment by senior politicians to a policy that designs crime in an epidemic way.
Thank you. So the first two are kind of both on moral hazard, really, and then this laws that design crime in.
I think the point about this, I think there's some areas where it's easier for the political action than others, I think, in relation to the question of victimless crime. So I think a lot of people do feel that there are certain victimless crimes and they feel less emotional about them and sort of let them go a little bit. Yeah. And I think this is a bit of a problem. So it's a bit of a problem in relation to corporate crime, which I think is a different domain. Because we've still got this image again of this sort of crime being stuff that people in black and white striped jerseys do with, the little visors.
Newcastle fans.
Yeah, Newcastle fans, that's right. God, what have I done there? It's all right. Most Geordies are very nice. So but because we've got that image, what we forget is actually that lots of people are committing illegal activity and breaking laws who are not necessarily conforming to that stereotype. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question about moral hazard, though. So, do you have an answer to your own question? No, okay. But I would say it's, in a way, that makes it easier to act because these crimes are less visible, so you can take more rational solutions to them. You can have conversations with industry about the share of risks and benefits, and you can think about cost benefits as those businesses do all the time. It's much harder to do that when you've got the image of a victim suffering physical violence on a front page. And so I think, in a way, we should concentrate on some of those areas for crime reduction first, because they are the easiest to sort of untangle and unpick. One of the things I cover in the book is the involvement of big tobacco in illicit tobacco smuggling and the black market of cigarettes. And it's very clear there that there was a strong self-interest for tobacco companies to allow this illegal trade because it basically meant they sold more cigarettes. And the degree to which the companies must have known that they were unknowingly, basically, but perhaps they could deniably but knowably facilitating a huge black market trade by selling cigarettes to people that they knew would end up on the black market untaxed was enormous. And that's the reason why they've paid out large fines and and obviously closed all of the information available to us about exactly what went on. But I think we could have a real focus on those sorts of crimes which look like they're more victimless, because we can maybe have a more rational debate, with the exception of drugs, which I'll come on to. On lock it or lose it, are you encouraging people to commit crime? Now, I think my answer is no. I think there's a question about who bears which costs, but I'm just pragmatic about it, I suppose. It tends to work, and it tends to lead to less people committing crime and then going to prison, which we have to pay for. It seems to me like it's worth the risk. And then, in some cases, individuals can choose not to take that risk, because there's not compulsion. So, one of my friends and mentors was director of strategy at the Home Office, a guy called Paul Maltby. And I don't know if he's here actually, probably not. He told me he'd just moved to the countryside and he had basically a fence that backed onto a playing field, and he was like, what? And he wanted to create a door in the back so he could walk out straight onto the playing fields because he thought this would be really nice. And yet he obviously does lots of work on crime policy, and so he knows that if he creates a door into the back of his property, he's more likely to be the victim of burglary. And he was like, but at the end of the day, I just really wanted to go out into that field. So he just puts the door in place, and he can take that risk. And I think that's sort of an area where you can maybe, as long as there's not compulsion, I think it's maybe it's okay. Drug policy.
Good luck.
Yeah, no, so it's interesting. You must be quite optimistic at the moment, actually, about the possibility of reform in the area of drug policy. Not in the UK. But if you look at what's happening in Canada at the moment with legalization of cannabis, marijuana, and if you look at what's happened in the US, there are encouraging signs that there is a willingness to think about doing some things differently. And I suppose, what are the conditions that have allowed that to happen there? Well, it seems to be, in Canada at least, that the condition is having a particular political leader who wants to do it, and is willing to make the argument and
Yes.
build constituencies of support and try and make it happen. And so I suppose this is interesting to me because I'm interested in broad-based influencing, but also in sort of elite influencing. So I suppose what it says is you've got to find all the people who are going to be the next Prime Minister and Home Secretary and make sure they understand what the benefits are of legalisation around lower-end drugs. And I do believe that for some drugs with lower harms, there are significant benefits to, at the very least, decriminalisation, because what we have done, both in the UK but particularly acutely in the US, is filled large amounts of prison space at great cost with people who are involved in drug trade, and to no real crime benefit, because most of those people who go in for drug dealing will be replaced because the consumer demand for that drug is there, and people will come in to provide for that drug. Which is why I think, in terms of policing terms, how do we respond to this? We should definitely be focusing on the harm that surrounds certain drug markets and the violence that surrounds them, and be targeting how do we reduce that as much as the underlying market itself, because it's very, very hard to do anything about it. But we should, at the same time, have a public health response to it, which is saying, how do we actually reduce demand for things that we do think are harmful and do ruin people's lives? And so I think that's the conversation that we need to have. But so I suppose I'm just saying, let's see if you can, how good's your political betting? You need to find the next Prime Minister and have a word.
We'll go back to the lock it or lose it. I love the example in your book of the Ford Cortina, where Ford manufactured a key that if you could enter one Ford Cortina, you could enter any other Ford Cortina, which I can only assume was because that if you've been in one Ford Cortina, you'd never want to go in another one again. Let's have another round of questions, and I'm going to get a gender balance this time. So I'm going to go with this lady here, I'm going to go with that lady there, and I'm going to go with the lady right at the back there.
Hello, my name is Farina Hefti. Thank you so much for this interesting talk. You talked a lot about influencing. So if you could achieve a complete change in the UK's general population's attitude towards using evidence base to solve crime, what would you want to see happen? Would you want it to be on EastEnders? What would you want to see to change the general public's attitude?
Great question. And it was this lady here, sorry.
Hi there. I'm interested in what your thoughts are on how charities use the voices of beneficiaries when they're trying to reduce crime, and what the public sector can learn from that, if anything, in terms of balancing the evidence base with listening to criminals who are reoffending again and again. Because I was just struck by the kind of absence of that in the Australian thing you spoke about, that actually if you get rid of people who are going to fight, it goes down, and I'm just wondering where their voices are in that and what your thoughts are on. Thank you.
Great. And it was this lady right at the back here.
Hi, I've actually just got a really simple question. How would you reduce rape and sexual violence?
Great.
Great. It's pretty
And
hard.
on the third one, it's one thing that struck me as well is that the problem-solving crimes that you talked about, car theft and metal theft and so on, have a quite discrete characteristic, whereas sort of sexual crimes or even domestic violence and crimes like that are obviously far more bigger and complex.
That's what you'd think. In terms of influencing change, so I've got to say this, buy the book. Everyone should buy a copy of the book. This is the only solution that I recommend. No, what would we? The challenge, I think. So one of the things I think is really hard is that one of the view I call the heroes and villains view is one that is really a permanent feature of good fiction. My favourite shows all have heroes and villains, and the hero is like someone who's maybe a little bit constrained by their bureaucratic system that they work within, but sort of, just goes above and beyond. And the person who's, the villain is like really bad, and they won't stop until ideally, the perfect endpoint for most crime fiction detective stories is that they die, but interestingly, quite often not killed by the hero. They have to fall off the edge of a cliff or something like that so that the hero is not completely guilty. And so there's something about the way in which we tell stories that perpetuates that particular myth, which I think is probably the dominant paradigm of crime in the UK. And so I'd like to find a different story form that is equally interesting for fiction, and then I think then we just need to perpetuate that a bit more. But I think it's really, really hard to change the views. We just need to, everyone from the conversations that people have to what the Home Secretary says in that speech that I disliked, to us here today, we just need to have a different type of conversation about what's happening.
Yeah. Okay.
Charities. So just to clarify on the Australian case. So I don't want to chuck everyone who might get into a fight out of the venue. I want to chuck some of them out because it changes the nature of the venue. If you think about why football violence has fallen, one of the factors will be all-seater, and one of the other factors will be mix of people going to football. And it's because I think that has had an impact. In terms of speaking to and engaging service users and what we can learn from charities, so it's quite hard with crime because some people who are ex-offenders are really good representatives of, are very good at coming forward and saying, this is what made me give up crime and all that sort of stuff. But when you look at the people who come forward most, it's actually victims. And if you look at what charities mostly do, actually, there's crime reduction charities who care about rehabilitation, but all the other charities are saying, well, I really care about domestic violence, and I really care about this, and I care about that, and I want you to take this more seriously. And the way you're going to take it more seriously is by increasing the punishment. So there's a whole set of charities that actually are lobbying for, broadly speaking, unevidence-based crime policy because they care about whatever their issue is of the day. So I actually think the charity sector has to think and reflect about what it's doing in terms of the criminal justice system and the impact it's having on the criminal justice system. But I'd be really interested in, I am really interested in learning about better ways of having a dialogue between policymakers and service users and victims and those sorts of things. So if you've got any ideas, then grab me afterwards, get me on Twitter or something, that'd be really good.
1 minute on.
1 minute on. God. I think Ken Clark tried to do 1 minute on this once, and he lost his job. My first thing is to say that actually one of the myths about sexual violence and rape is that the people who commit that crime are somehow completely different. This is real heroes and villains territory. Anyone who crosses into that taboo is sort of socially reprehensible. We must get rid of them. That's the sort of natural psychological response, and it's an emotional response that I have as well. But it again neglects the fact that actually a lot of those crimes that are sexual offences happen in certain circumstances, and we need to understand the patterns of why they're occurring and when they're occurring. There is never an excuse for committing that sort of crime, but that doesn't mean we can't reduce some of the risks. So one of the things that we did have was a spate of sexual assaults around unlicensed taxis, where people were getting into cars of people who could be anybody, and quite often were anybody. Now, what's changed the amount of those types of offences happening? It's nothing to do with policing. It's the fact that we've got Uber, which is like cheaper and better. And so in some way, that has reduced risk around sexual violence. The other thing you notice about sexual violence is it is a crime of opportunity, and even the most morally difficult and crimes around sexual offences against children, you notice that the patterns of offending for offenders in that group are different again. So you'll notice they tend to, in terms of ages of committing crime, they tend to be a bit older, because that's the age at which they have access to kids, be it young relatives, people they're meant to be in charge of, and all those sorts of things. And there's a denial that people can, on some occasions, actually commit those crimes, in a sense, out of character, not, again, going out deliberately, but being tempted into them. And I think that we need to have that view, as well as recognising that there are probably deep traumatic experiences that people have had that push them in that direction, and the fact that some people are just going to do things that are wrong and they need to be punished for them. But having that more nuanced picture and appreciation that this is not just the crime of someone desperately determined to go out and commit an offence, I think is important.
Okay. Thank you very much. There's loads in this. You'll discover that if you like Inspector Morse or Sherlock Holmes, like Tom, you're a heroes and villains style person, or if you like The Wire, The Godfather and Sopranos like me, you're a victims and survivors style person. But I highly recommend the book. It's available at the back of the room after this session, but for now, thanks very much to Tom. Good. Could have gone on for ages.